Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Members Question and Answer. Now today we're answering comments and questions from our channel members on Frontline episodes and other videos about the war in Ukraine and its impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm one of the presenters on Times Radio Frontline, but I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer, NATO planner, and I commentate on all matters defence, geopolitics, cyber, terrorism, security, and anything else that people ask me to do around the world. So I'm going to go straight into your questions. We've got some good questions today. First one's from Astro. Good to hear from you again. Before I get in, there's not enough questions and we need more people putting questions underneath. So come on, give us more to choose from, please, folks. So Astro, America still needs to look into how the Pentagon brass hats unilaterally diverted arms promised to Ukraine. Surely this isn't how it's supposed to work. Now, this is looking at the fact that the US Department of Defense stopped a shipment of weapons to Ukraine, turning around and citing the fact that it took US national stocks below an acceptable level. Excuse book, volume 2, excuse number 3, I think. That's the book of weird and unusual excuses or common excuses. And then we get Donald Trump saying he didn't know anything about it. And it's quite clear that this hadn't been cleared through the White House. So it's one of two things has happened here. It's either in putting the package together and authorizing that to be shipped out, the spreadsheets on the computers that have said, have alarmed and said, hey, our stocks, our national stocks of these particular natures of ammunition or weapons are getting to a low level. Do you wish to proceed or not? And someone at a very low level is going, oh, we need to stop this and look at it in more detail. Or it's Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of State for Defense, who has been very vocal in his anti-Ukrainian stance and questioning why the US is supplying weapons to Ukraine, has put a policy statement out across the department saying, stop this shipment. I think as soon as it got to the White House, it's caused sufficient political embarrassment, and we've had subsequent statements from Donald Trump saying that they're starting again. But it shows that there is an issue somewhere in the political decision-making process between the Pentagon, between the White House, and all of those that are involved in it. And hopefully that has been resolved, because it has caused a degree of anxiousness, I think, that the Russians can exploit and will have exploited it and will continue to try and exploit that in the information domain. But yes, good question, good point, Astro. Marty, you're next. You say, I'm surprised more Russian soldiers don't go AWOL, facing years in prison for harsh, for sure, but that's better than getting killed. The years in prison is harsh. From what I'm hearing, it's not quite as harsh in the Ukrainian prisoner of war camps than it is on the front line for the Russians. But again, the Russian soldiers, a lot of the individuals that are on the front line are not very literate. They have been told that if they get captured by the Ukrainians, they will be executed by the Ukrainians after being tortured. They've been told that if they get captured by the Ukrainians, their families back in Russia will get dealt with by the Russian authorities. And therefore, they're between a rock and a hard place. And they've been told if they try and run away from the front line, and we know that there are stories of Russian formations being put in place and units being put in place to shoot individuals that are trying to run away from the front lines. So the pressure is on them to go forward. And again, a lot of the individuals know that if they do get killed, then their families will get properly compensated. And they've got to a point where they don't really care, I think. But the Ukrainians are taking huge numbers of prisoners. And from what I'm hearing, they are looking after them and looking after them up to Geneva Convention standards, which is a good thing and a much better life for the Russians. And we saw that in the prisoner exchange. The Russian prisoners that were being handed back were well fed, they looked healthy, and they had a bit of spirit about them. Ukrainian prisoners that came back into Ukraine were disheveled, had lost huge amounts of weight and suffering major medical issues. That shows the differences between the two regimes. Marty again, so if that initial bunch were more elite than regular, then ouch, you're talking about the initial bunch of North Korean troops that operated in Kursk working with the Russians, and they were more elite. A lot of them were their special forces than just the regular forces. So many of them died because they hadn't got a clue what was going on. Yes, they weren't quite sure what was happening outside the tactical level and putting it into context, but from what I understand, they were fighting a good tactical fight. They knew good basic infantry tactics. They could shoot straight, they could fire and maneuver, they could take cover. Much better trained than many of the Russian conscripts that are, or the Russian, they're not conscripts, Russian soldiers that are being pushed out into the front line. Of course, under the Russian constitution, conscripts are not allowed to be put into a war zone. There were many operating in Kursk because that was not considered a war zone. And the DPRK, or the North Korean troops, they've got those good basic standards, but anything that took them outside very, very basic soldiering in a Soviet-style tactical environment, they couldn't cope with. And that's why the Ukrainians, who have got a much more maneuver and mission command type approach, still not as good as Western troops, but could outmaneuver them and cause them real difficulties. And that's why the North Korean troops suffered lots of casualties. I do understand there's another 30,000 North Koreans coming in, potentially. We've got that from South Korean intelligence. Next point from Julian. What about Ukrainian commandos taking on tankers and selling the oil? You're talking here about the Russian grey fleet tankers that are moving oil around the world from Russian ports and then selling it to the Indians, to the Chinese and elsewhere. One of the problems about Ukrainian commandos taking the tankers is that a lot of these tankers are not operating out of Black Sea based ports, and therefore the Ukrainian commandos would need to get to where they're operating out of, in the Baltic, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. You need a naval force that can help you get there and help stop the ships, and that would have some jurisdictional issues. Much better for them to try and convince the EU and other nations to deal with these grey fleet tankers themselves, and that can be done through political pressure. I think the Ukrainians need their commandos on the front line rather than going off and doing this. But a good idea, and the sentiment's right, we need to stop this grey fleet tanker fleet from selling Russian oil and bankrupt Russia, stop it from being able to fund its war. Final question today is from Kathy, and you Kathy, slightly tongue-in-cheek, say, I guess China believes in unfair invasion and strikes on civilian locations. Yes, we don't quite know what China believes. They're very much sitting on the fence. They're providing a lot of tacit behind-the-scenes support to Russia, but they're not going one step over that line and getting more directly involved in the way that North Korea is. I think China might be pushing things through North Korea. And of course, there are reports of Chinese observers, military observers, watching what the Russians are doing. What pressure is going on behind closed doors is difficult to assess. But what was interesting, I think, in the past week is China turning around and saying they're not going to let Russia lose this war. How that's going to play out will be very interesting indeed. Let's hope they're not going to get more drawn in. They're supplying components for weapons, dual-use components that have got a civilian use but can be used to manufacture weapon systems and other small levels of support. They're getting a lot back from that. China will be supporting Russia from a perspective of what they can get out of it rather than what they can do to support Russia. We'll see more as this develops over the coming months. So folks, thanks for watching this week's Q&A and for posting your questions. Please post more. And remember, if you want access to our exclusive videos and have your questions answered, please sign up for Times Radio membership. And of course, we're now available on any of your favourite podcast outlets. So just search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.